The day I found out my parents sold my custom wheelchair to buy Lily's wedding dress was the day I discovered what true betrayal felt like. Picture this. You're already struggling to navigate a world that wasn't built for you and the two people who should protect you most decide your mobility is worth less than white silk and rhinestones. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Death gave me a second chance. And this time, I wasn't going to be the family's silent sacrifice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of our Maple Street home in Riverside Heights, casting long shadows across the breakfast table, where our family's hierarchy had been carved in stone for as long as I could remember. Lily sat, perched on her usual chair, had her perfectly straightened hair, catching the light as she scrolled through wedding magazines with the concentration of a surgeon. Across from her, our mother Susan hovered like a devoted assistant, refilling her coffee cup before it was even half empty. The Vera Wang dress we saw yesterday would be absolutely perfect, Lily gushed, her manicured finger tracing the glossy. Paige, it's exactly what I've been dreaming of since I was little. The way the bodice catches the light, and that train, oh my God, Mom, can you imagine how stunning the photos will be? Susan's eyes lit up with the same fervor she once reserved for Lily's piano recitals and beauty pageant victories. Sweetheart, whatever makes you happy. This is your special day and you deserve to feel like a princess. I maneuvered my wheelchair closer to the table, the familiar squeak of the left wheel announcing my presence. The conversation didn't pause. It never did when I entered a room anymore. 3 years ago, before the accident that changed everything, I might have joined in their excitement, offering opinions about dress styles or venue decorations. Now, I felt like a ghost haunting my own family's breakfast table. Morning, I said, reaching for the orange juice pitcher. The movement required me to lean forward awkwardly. My balance shifted by the angle of my chair. In my old wheelchair, the one specifically fitted to my measurements and needs, this simple task would have been effortless. But that chair was gone. Sold to some stranger while I was at physical therapy, placed by this basic hospital model that felt like wearing shoes 3 sizes too small. Robert, my father, glanced up from his newspaper, just long enough to grunt a greeting before diving back into the financial section. His morning routine had become a masterclass in avoidance since I'd come home from the rehabilitation center. Eye contact was apparently too much to ask for. "Emma, honey, could you keep it down a little?" Susan said without looking in my direction. Lily's trying to concentrate on some very important decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being asked to be quieter while sitting in a wheelchair that announced my every movement with mechanical protests. But pointing out irony had become a luxury I couldn't afford in the Chen household. Lily's wedding planning had transformed our home into a sacred temple where her needs transcended everyone else's existence. "Actually," Lily said, finally acknowledging my presence with the kind of smile she'd perfected for distant relatives and unwanted acquaintances. "Here, wanted to talk to you about the wedding party." My heart did a small skip. Despite everything, despite the constant feeling of being pushed to the margins of my own family, part of me still hoped for inclusion. Still craved the sisterly bond we'd shared before my accident turned me into an inconvenience. Thinking really hard about this, she continued, her voice taking on that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in fake consideration. "And I've decided it would be better if you weren't in the wedding party." The orange juice glass slipped from my fingers, but my reflexes caught it before it could shatter on the floor. The liquid sloshed but didn't spill. Wished it had. A broken glass would have given me something concrete to focus on, instead of the crushing weight of rejection settling in my chest. "I mean, think about it practically," Lily rushed on, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to justify what couldn't be justified. "The church has those narrow aisles, and with your chair, it would be really difficult to coordinate. Plus, all the bridesmaids need to wear these gorgeous heels I picked out, and obviously you can't." She gestured vaguely at my legs, as if my paralysis was a fashion choice I'd made to spite her special day. Susan nodded along enthusiastically, as if Lily had just solved world hunger instead of excluding her disabled sister from one of the most important events of her life. "Lily's right, sweetheart. It's better to be practical about these things. You understand, don't you?" Understanding. That's what they always asked of me. Understanding when family photos were taken at locations with stairs I couldn't navigate. Understanding when family dinners were planned at restaurants without accessible restrooms. Understanding when my needs came dead last behind everyone else's. Convenience? But I started, hating how small my voice sounded. Besides, Lily interrupted, her tone brightening, as if she'd just thought of the perfect consolation prize. Someone needs to handle the guest book, right? That's actually a really important job. You'd be sitting right at the entrance, welcoming everyone. It's perfect. Perfect. Like a consolation prize wrapped in pretty paper. Like being given a participation trophy while watching everyone else compete for the real thing. I wanted to scream, to demand better, to ask why my sister's comfort mattered. More than my inclusion, instead, I forced my face into the neutral expression I'd perfected over the past 3 years. Sure, I said. That sounds fine. The relief on both their faces was immediate and nauseating. Crisis averted. Problem solved. Emma handled with a minimum amount of fuss. They returned to their wedding magazine as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just carved another piece of my dignity away with their casual cruelty. Robert finally looked up from his paper, but only to address Lily. Have you and Jake set a final budget for everything? I want to make sure we're not getting in over our heads. Oh, Daddy, don't worry about money. Lily laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. We can figure out the details later. The casual dismissal of financial concerns would have been laughable, if it weren't so typical. When Lily needed something, money was just a detail to be worked out later. When I needed a proper wheelchair, a vehicle modification, or accessible housing. Suddenly every dollar required a family council and detailed justification. I wheeled myself toward the living room, needing distance from their gleeful planning session. The hardwood floors that had once been my favorite feature of our house now felt like an obstacle course. Every slight bump and imperfection registered through the rigid frame of my temporary chair, reminding me of what I'd lost. In the living room, I found my laptop and opened my email, hoping for distraction in the mundane world of accessibility. Advocacy work. My job at the downtown community center paid poorly, but gave me purpose, helping other people navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of disability resources. It was ironic, really. Spent my days helping strangers fight for accommodations. While my own family couldn't be bothered to consider my basic needs, a new message caught my attention. Alex Thompson had sent another of his cheerful updates from the adaptive sports program at City Park. Alex had been my physical therapist's recommendation, a former Paralympic athlete who now coached wheelchair racing. He'd been trying to convince me to join his training group for months, sending photos of their weekend practices and achievement celebrations. Hey Emma, his latest message read, I know you keep saying you're not ready, but I'm not giving up on you. We had an amazing practice session yesterday, and I kept thinking how much you'd love the speed work we're doing. The team is really supportive, and honestly, I think you'd be flying past all of us within a month. What do you say? Just come watch. Sometime, no pressure. Alex's persistence should have been annoying, but instead it felt like a lifeline. Someone believed I was capable of more than managing guest books and staying out of the way. Someone saw potential instead of limitations. I was typing a response when Lily's voice drifted from the kitchen, high and excited. Mom, I've been thinking about the dress budget, and I really think we need to go higher. The Vera Wang is perfect, but there's also this Monique Lullier that would be absolutely stunning for the reception. Maybe we could do both? 2 dresses? Susan's voice held the kind of wonder usually reserved for discovering buried treasure. It's becoming really popular. Lots of brides are doing it now. One for the ceremony, one for the reception. Honestly, with all the photos Jake's family is planning, having options would be amazing. My fingers froze over the keyboard. 2 dresses. Lily wanted 2 wedding dresses while I was sitting in a borrowed wheelchair that didn't fit properly, and gave me pressure sores after an hour of use. The magnitude of the inequality hit me like a physical blow. I wheeled back toward the kitchen, drawn by a masochistic need to hear more of their financial planning. Robert had folded his newspaper and was leaning forward with the intense focus he usually reserved for business negotiations. "How much are we talking about realistically?" he asked. Lily pulled out her phone and began scrolling through saved screenshots. "Well, the Vera Wang is 8,000, and the Monique Lullier is around 6. But then there's alterations. Shoes, undergarments, the veil." She rattled off numbers with the casual ease of someone who'd never had to choose between medical equipment and basic comfort. $14,000. For dresses she'd wear for a combined total of maybe 8 hours. My custom wheelchair, the one that had taken months to design and fit properly, had cost $12,000. The one they'd sold without consulting me to fund this fairy tale wedding that I wasn't even allowed to participate in properly. "That seems reasonable," Robert said, and I had to grip my armrests to keep from laughing hysterically at the word reasonable. "You think so?" Lily beamed. "I was worried you'd think it was too much. Sweetheart, you only get married once. We want this to be perfect for you. You only get married once, but you live in a body every single day." The thought screamed through my mind with such force I was surprised they couldn't hear it. But their conversation continued, a symphony of wedding planning that drowned out everything else. "Oh, and I've been thinking about the reception venue," Lily continued. "The grand ballroom quoted us $15,000, but it includes everything catering, flowers, music, the works. And it's absolutely gorgeous. Remember when we went to the Morrison wedding there last year? More numbers, more casual spending of money that could have transformed my daily existence?" I thought about my friend Jessica from college, who'd sent me links to accessible apartments downtown, places where I could live independently, close to work, with roll-in showers and properly designed kitchen counters. The security deposits alone were more than I could save in a year, especially since most of my salary went toward medical expenses and transportation. "Emma, honey," Susan called, finally noticing my presence again. "Could you help us with something? We're trying to figure out the seating arrangements, and we need someone to count chairs." Count chairs. Of course, because arithmetic was apparently the highest level of wedding participation they trusted me with. I wanted to tell them exactly what they could do with their chair counting, but instead, I found myself nodding and wheeling closer to their planning session. The kitchen table was now covered with printed floor plans, guest lists, and fabric. Samples Lily had created a color-coded system that would have impressed a military strategist. Everything was organized, beautiful, and completely centered around her vision of perfection.
Ow.
"So we're thinking round tables of 8, Lily explained, pointing to circles drawn on the venue map. "But we need to make sure the spacing works for it." She paused, glancing at my wheelchair with the kind of calculation usually reserved for furniture measurements. "For accessibility," I finished, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "Right. We want to make sure you can get around comfortably." The consideration was superficial and came too late. They were willing to adjust table spacing, but not their budget priorities. They'd accommodate my wheelchair at the reception, but not in the ceremony itself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was the kind of partial inclusion that somehow felt worse than complete exclusion. I spent the next hour helping them map out seating arrangements, while listening to increasingly elaborate descriptions of flower arrangements, menu options, and entertainment plans. Every detail was meticulously planned and funded without question. The casual mention of a $5,000 string quartet didn't even make them blink. But I remembered Robert's lecture about the cost of my medications. Just last month. "You know what would be amazing?" Lily said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with inspiration. "If we could get those special chairs for the ceremony, the ones with the white covers and gold ties. They rent them from that fancy place downtown." "How much?" Robert asked automatically. "Only $300 for the whole set. It would make such a difference in the photos." $300 for decorative chair covers that would be used for 2 hours. I thought about my physical therapy co-pays, currently 3 months behind because I'd been prioritizing other expenses. I thought about the ergonomic cushions that would prevent my pressure sores, but cost more than we could apparently afford. I thought about the vehicle modifications that would let me drive independently instead of relying on paratransit and the kindness of others. "Absolutely," Robert said. "This is your day, princess. We want everything to be perfect. Princess. He'd called Lily Princess since we were children, but the endearment had taken on a different weight after my accident. Now it felt like a title that came with privileges I'd never be eligible for again. Princesses didn't need accessible transportation or adaptive equipment. Princesses wore beautiful gowns and walked down aisles in high heels while they're wheelchair-bound. Sisters counted chairs and managed guest books. My phone buzzed with another message from Alex. This time it was a photo from their morning practice session, showing a group of athletes racing around the track with expressions of pure joy and determination. The caption read, "This could be you, Emma, when you're ready to remember how strong you are." Strong. The word felt foreign after 3 years of being treated like damaged goods. But looking at those faces, seeing the fierce competition and obvious camaraderie, something stirred. In my chest that I'd thought was permanently buried under layers of family disappointment and societal pity. "I think I'm going to head out for a while," I announced, closing my laptop with more force than necessary. "Where are you going?" Susan asked absently, not looking up from a catering menu. "City Park. There's a training session I want to check." Out. That got their attention. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from surprise to concern. "Training for what?" Lily asked. "Wheelchair racing?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear their mental calculations about insurance liability and public embarrassment. In their minds, I was supposed to be grateful for small accommodations and quiet acceptance, not pursuing activities that might draw attention to my disability. "Is that safe?" Susan asked carefully. "Safer than sitting around feeling sorry?" For myself, the words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't apologize. For once, I wanted them to feel a fraction of the discomfort they'd been serving me for years. Emma Roberts' voice carried a warning tone I recognized from childhood. "We're just concerned about you getting your hopes up. These things can be very competitive, and you're still adjusting." Still adjusting. I was still supposedly in some kind of adaptation phase that would magically end when I finally accepted my reduced status in the family hierarchy. "I've been adjusting for 3 years," I said, backing my chair away from their planning session. "Maybe it's time I started living instead." I left them sitting there surrounded by wedding magazines and budget spreadsheets, their shocked faces, reflecting in the kitchen window as I headed for the front door. Getting out of the house required navigating 2 small steps that had become my daily reminder of how little thought had been given to my needs when they'd chosen this place. The temporary ramp Robert had installed was narrow and steep, more of a gesture toward accessibility than actual accommodation. The spring air hit my face as I made my way down Maple Street toward the bus stop. Public transportation was another. Adventure and patience and planning. But it beat staying home and listening to more discussions about chair covers and dress alterations. The route to City Park involved 2 transfers and took almost an hour, but it was worth it for the independence. As the bus pulled away from my stop, I could see the training group in the distance. Alex had been right about the speed work day, where watching them race around the track was like seeing a completely different version of what a wheelchair could be. It's not a medical device or a symbol of limitation, but a piece of athletic equipment capable of incredible performance. Alex spotted me before I'd made it halfway across the parking lot. His face lit up with the kind of genuine excitement I hadn't seen directed at me in months. He jogged over, his own racing chair on wheels beside him like a loyal dog. "Emma, you came." His enthusiasm was infectious and overwhelming. "This is perfect timing. We're just finishing up interval training, but I can introduce you to everyone." The group was just as welcoming as Alex had promised. No one stared at my inadequate chair or asked invasive questions about my accident. They talked about racing strategy and upcoming competitions with the same passion Lily brought to wedding planning. But their excitement felt inclusive rather than exclusive. "You should try a practice run," suggested Maria, a woman about my age with arms that looked like they could bench press a car. "We've got a spare racing chair you could use." The racing wheelchair was nothing like what I was used to, lower longer, built for speed rather than daily navigation. Getting into it required help and felt awkward at first, but once I was settled, something clicked. The first push around. The track was tentative, but by the second lap, I was beginning to understand what Alex saw in this sport. Speed, not the careful, measured movement of daily life, but actual velocity. The wind in my hair, the burn in my shoulders, the ground, rushing past faster than it had in years. For the first time since my accident, I felt powerful instead of pitied. When I finally stopped, breathing hard and grinning despite myself, Alex was waiting with an expression of pure satisfaction. So he said, "When do you want to start training for real?" The question should have terrified me. Meant commitment, competition, putting myself out there in ways that my family would probably find embarrassing or inappropriate. But sitting there in a chair designed for achievement rather than accommodation, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Existed hope. Next week, I heard myself saying, "I want to start next week." Alex's smile could have powered the entire park. "Perfect. I'll get you set up with a proper chair, and we'll start with basics. Emma, you're going to love this." As I transferred back to my everyday wheelchair for the journey home, I felt different. Lighter somehow, despite the weight of family disapproval I knew was waiting for me. For the first time in 3 years, I had something to look forward to that was entirely mine. The bus ride home gave me time to think about what I'd committed to, and with each mile, my determination grew stronger. Lily could have her perfect wedding with her perfect dresses and her perfectly able-bodied bridal party. I was going to have something better. I was going to have my life back. The Monday morning after my first visit to City Park, I wheeled into the kitchen to find Lily already deep in conversation with someone on her phone, gesturing wildly with her free hand while balancing a mug of coffee in the other. Her voice carried that particular pitch of excitement that meant another wedding expense was about to be justified. No, you don't understand," she was saying to whoever had the misfortune of being on the other end. "The ice sculptures aren't just decorative. They're part of the whole winter wonderland theme we're going for. It's going to be absolutely magical." Ice sculptures. In April? For a wedding that was already consuming more money than most people saw in 2 years? I maneuvered around her extended arm to reach the coffee pot, my movement apparently invisible to her wedding-focused tunnel vision. "Emma, perfect timing," Susan said, peering from the pantry with her arms full of bridal magazines that must have multiplied overnight. "We need to talk about your outfit for the wedding." My outfit. Right. Because managing the guest book apparently required a specific wardrobe that needed family approval. I poured my coffee slowly, buying time to prepare for whatever new layer of exclusion was about to be revealed. "I was thinking something simple," I said carefully. "Maybe that navy dress I wore to Cousin Michelle's graduation." The look Susan gave me suggested I'd just proposed showing up in pajamas. "Oh, honey, no. The dress is far too casual for Lily's wedding. This is going to be a very elegant affair." It's elegant. Translation. Expensive. I could already see where this conversation was headed, and it wasn't toward my nearly empty bank account. "We found the most beautiful dress at Nordstrom yesterday," Susan continued, her voice taking on that particular enthusiasm she reserved for spending money on things that weren't medical necessities. "It's perfect for someone in your situation." Someone in my situation. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Not for someone like me, not for someone my size or style preference, but for someone in my situation. A euphemism wrapped around the reality that I was being dressed to match my reduced role in the family hierarchy. "It's powder blue, very sophisticated," Susan went on, oblivious to my internal recoil. "The best part is that it's designed to look good while sitting down. The skirt falls perfectly when you're in your chair. It's designed to look good while sitting down, as if standing up was something other people chose to do recreationally rather than something I physically couldn't do." The clinical description of the dress felt like a medical diagnosis, disguised as fashion advice. "How much?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be irrelevant to whether I had any say in the purchase. "Don't worry about that," Susan waved off my concern with the same gesture she'd used to dismiss a fly. "Your father and I discussed it, and we want to make sure you look appropriate for the photos. Appropriate for the photos. Not beautiful, not confident, not like myself, but appropriate. Like a prop that needed to blend into the background without causing visual disruption to the main event." Lily finally ended her phone call, and turned her attention to our conversation with the lazy interest of someone eavesdropping on a television show. "Oh good, you found something for Emma." I was getting worried about the photos. Photographer is really focused on cohesive visual storytelling. Wedding planning had apparently elevated to the level of cinema. Production, complete with costume design for the supporting characters. I wondered what role I was supposed to play in this visual story. The brave disabled sister. The grateful family member who knew her place. The inspiration porn that would make other people feel better about their own lives? "Actually," I said, setting my coffee mug down with more force than necessary, "I might not be able to make it to the wedding after all." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming and the neighbor's dog barking. 3 houses away. Both women stared at me as if I'd just announced my intention to join a traveling circus. "What do you mean, you might not be able to make it?" Lily's voice climbed an octave. "Emma, this is my wedding. Of course you're going to be there." "Started training," I said, the words feeling foreign but powerful in my mouth. "Wheelchair. Racing. And there might be a competition that weekend." It was a lie. The next competition wasn't for another month, and I'd only had 1 training session that could barely be called training. But something about their assumption that I'd always be available, always ready to play my assigned role, ignited a spark of rebellion I'd thought was permanently extinguished. "Training for what?" Susan asked, her tone suggesting I'd claimed. "To be preparing for space travel, Paralympic-style racing. I'm working with a coach, and apparently I have some natural talent for it." Another lie, though Alex had said something encouraging about my form during that single practice session. But watching their faces process this information was worth the fictional embellishment. Lily's expression shifted from confusion to irritation to something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Emma, you can't just decide to skip my wedding. For some hobby you just started. It's the most important day of my life. The most important day of her life. Not one of the most important, not particularly meaningful, but the single most significant 24-hour period in her entire existence. And apparently my presence was crucial to that significance, despite being excluded from any meaningful participation." "It's not a hobby," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "It's a sport. A competitive sport that requires serious training and commitment." "But you just started," Susan protested. "Surely they can't expect you to compete so." Soon they couldn't because there was no competition. But the assumption that my time and commitments were infinitely flexible, always available to be rearranged around Lily's needs, felt like a weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten. It was there. "Athletic talent doesn't wait for convenient timing," I said, borrowing a phrase I'd heard Alex use with one of his other athletes. "When you have an opportunity to compete at this level, you take it." "What level?" Lily's voice was sharp now. "Emma, you've been in a wheelchair for 3 years? Can't just suddenly become a serious athlete." There it was. The truth underneath all their concern and confusion in their minds. My accident hadn't just changed my mobility. It had fundamentally altered what I was capable of achieving. I was supposed to be grateful for inclusion, not demanding excellence. I was supposed to manage guest books, not race for medals. "Why not?" I asked. "What exactly prevents me from becoming a serious athlete?" The question hung in the air between us, and I could see them struggling to find an answer that didn't reveal the full depth of their assumptions about my limitations. Because the real answer was nothing. Nothing prevented me from becoming a serious athlete except their belief that disabled people should be satisfied with participation trophies and inspirational platitudes. Do's and started, then stopped, clearly realizing that any explanation would expose attitudes she probably didn't want to examine too closely. "It's just that we need you at the wedding," Lily finished, her tone shifting to the wheedling sweetness she'd perfected as a child. "Emma, I know we haven't always been perfect, but you're my sister. I want you there, want not need, despite her earlier claim about photo composition and visual storytelling. Want with all the casual entitlement of someone who'd never had, to consider whether their wants aligned with other people's needs or possibilities. I'll think about it," I said, which was more consideration than they'd given my needs in recent memory. The conversation shifted after that, turning to safer topics like floral arrangements and catering options, but something had changed in the dynamic. I'd introduced uncertainty into their carefully planned narrative, and they didn't quite know how to respond. Over the next few days, I threw myself into training with an intensity that surprised even Alex. I arrived at City Park every morning at 7, spending 2 hours working on technique and endurance before heading to my job at the community center. The physical exhaustion was addictive. Replacing the emotional fatigue I'd been carrying for years with something clean and purposeful. "You're picking this up incredibly fast," Alex told me after a particularly good session. "I've been coaching for 8 years, and I've never seen someone develop race pace this quickly." Race pace. The phrase sent a thrill through me that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with possibility. For the first time since my accident, someone was measuring my progress against athletic standards rather than medical ones. "There's a regional qualifier in 6 weeks, Alex continued, apparently reading my thoughts. "It's probably too soon, but if you keep improving at this rate—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication was clear. I could be competitive. Not inspirational, not brave, not overcoming anything, but actually competitive on athletic merit. "What would I need to do to qualify?" I asked. "Keep training exactly like you're doing. Work on your starts, improve your corner technique, and build up your endurance base." "But Emma," his expression grew serious. "It's a serious commitment. Training 6 days a week, strict nutrition, lifestyle changes. It's not compatible with treating this as a hobby. 6 days a week, strict nutrition, lifestyle changes. Everything Lily's wedding planning had demanded of our entire family, but directed toward my goals instead of hers." The symmetry was almost poetic. "I'm ready for that," I said, and meant it. That evening, I came home to find the entire kitchen table covered with wedding planning materials that seemed to multiply daily. Guest lists, seating charts, vendor contracts, and fabric samples created a paper landscape that had completely consumed the space where our family used to eat meals together. "Perfect timing," Robert said as I wheeled through the door. "We need to talk about transportation for the wedding day." Transportation, right? Because getting me to and from the venue required special planning that normal family members didn't need. I braced myself for another conversation about my logistical complications. "The wedding party is taking a chartered bus to the church," Robert continued, "but obviously that won't work for you. I was thinking we could arrange for a medical transport van. A medical transport van. To a wedding. As if I needed an ambulance to attend my sister's ceremony rather than simply a vehicle with a ramp or lift. The medicalization of my transportation felt like another small humiliation wrapped in practical concern. "I can arrange my own transportation," I said. "How?" Lily looked up from her seating chart with genuine confusion. "Emma, the church is 20 miles away, and you don't drive." "I don't drive." Present tense, as if it were a permanent condition rather than a temporary situation caused by their refusal to help with vehicle modifications. I'd been saving for hand controls for 2 years, setting aside small amounts from my community center. Salary, but medical bills, and basic living expenses kept consuming the fund before it could grow large enough. "I'll figure it out," I said. "Sweetheart, be practical," Susan interjected. "The medical transport is covered by insurance, and they're used to handling wheelchairs safely. Not accommodation, not accessibility, but medical intervention. To manage the risk of my presence." "Actually," I said, the lie forming even as I spoke, "Alex offered to drive me. He has a modified van." This was completely fictional. Alex drove a small sports car that probably couldn't fit a standard wheelchair, let alone transport one. But the fiction served a purpose, establishing that I had options they hadn't considered and people in my life they didn't control. "Who's Alex?" Lily asked. The word coach seemed to catch them off guard, carrying implications of serious athletic pursuit that didn't fit their image of my wheelchair-bound limitations. Coaches were for people with competitive goals, not for people managing medical conditions. "Your coach," Robert repeated slowly. "Which is for this racing thing you're doing?" "Wheelchair racing," I corrected. "And yes, he's a former Paralympic athlete who now trains competitive racers." Paralympic. The word carried weight they couldn't dismiss, as easily as hobby or therapy. Paralympics meant elite athletics, international competition, genuine. Achievement measured against global standards. It's wonderful, Susan said, though her tone suggested she found it more concerning than wonderful. But surely he'd understand that family comes first. Family comes first. The phrase had been weaponized against me so many times, I'd developed an allergic reaction to its sound. Family comes first, so I should accept exclusion from the wedding party. Family comes first, so my wheelchair could be sold to fund wedding expenses. My transportation needs were secondary to their convenience. He understands that athletic opportunities are time-sensitive, I said. You can't just postpone training because of social events. Social events. I'd deliberately chosen the phrase to minimize the wedding's importance, and I could see it land. Like a small slap across Lily's face. Her wedding wasn't a social event. It was the culmination of months of planning and thousands of dollars in family investment. Emma, Lily's voice carried a warning. This is my wedding we're talking about, not some random social event. And this is my athletic career we're talking about, not some random hobby. The parallel structure of our sentences hung in the air, both of us claiming priority for our respective pursuits. But where her wedding planning had consumed the entire family's attention and resources for months, my athletic training was being treated as an inconvenient distraction from my supporting role in her story. Athletic career, Robert's tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the skepticism underneath. Emma, let's be realistic about this. You've been training for what, a week? 2 weeks, I corrected, though it felt longer. Every morning. At the track, every evening practicing transfers and techniques. Every moment of soreness and improvement had expanded my sense of what was possible. 2 weeks, he repeated. And you're ready to call it a career? The dismissal in his voice was familiar, but felt different now. Instead of the crushing weight it used to carry, it felt like fuel for the fire that training had lit inside me. Let him doubt. Let him all doubt. I was discovering muscles I'd forgotten I had, speeds I'd never imagined achieving. A version of myself that existed completely outside their expectations. I'm ready to find out what I'm capable of, I said. That night, alone in my room with the sounds of continued wedding planning drifting up from the kitchen, I researched everything I could find about competitive wheelchair racing. Training schedules, nutrition plans, equipment specifications, competition calendars. The sport had a structure and progression that made sense. Unlike the arbitrary accommodations and limitations my family had constructed around my disability, I also researched the regional qualifier Alex had mentioned. 6 weeks away in Sacramento, with prize money and ranking points that could lead to bigger competitions. The entry requirements were specific but achievable: proof of coaching, medical clearance, and qualifying times that I was already close to meeting. More importantly, the competition date was exactly 1 week after Lily's wedding. Close enough to create the transportation conflict I'd invented, but not so close that I couldn't attend both if I really wanted to. But sitting there in the dark, scrolling through race results and athlete profiles, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't want to attend both. Didn't want to spend Lily's wedding day managing guest books and wearing powder, blue dresses designed to look appropriate while sitting down. I didn't want to smile graciously while being excluded from family photos because my wheelchair disrupted the visual composition. I wanted to spend that energy on something that was entirely mine, something where my presence was valued for what I contributed rather than tolerated for what I represented. Something where success was measured by performance rather than gratitude. The next morning I found Alex already setting up equipment when I arrived at the track. He'd mentioned having an early meeting with one of his elite athletes, but I hadn't expected to see her in person. Maria Santos was everything I'd imagined a Paralympic racer would be, and more. Her shoulders and arms showed the kind of development that came from years of serious training, but it was her focus that really impressed me. She approached each drill with the intensity of someone for whom fractions of seconds mattered. You must be Emma, she said after completing a set of sprint intervals that left me breathless just watching. Alex has been talking about you. Nothing too embarrassing, I hope. Just that you're picking this up faster than anyone he's coached. She grabbed a towel and wiped the sweat from her face. He thinks you could be competitive within a year if you stick with it? A year. Not someday, not eventually, but within a specific, achievable time frame. The precision of the prediction felt like a gift after years of vague encouragements to keep trying and stay positive. "What's competitive look like?" I asked. "Depends what you want," Maria said, settling into her racing chair with the easy familiarity of someone for whom it was a tool rather than a medical device. "Regional competitions, national championships, Paralympic trials. If you're really good and really committed, Paralympic trials." The phrase sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. 2 weeks ago, my biggest goal had been getting through Lily's wedding without crying. Someone was casually mentioning Paralympic trials as a possibility rather than a fantasy. "The thing is," Maria continued, "it requires everything. Your schedule, your diet, your social life, your money. You can't half-face it and expect results. Everything." The word should have been intimidating, but instead it felt like permission. Permission to prioritize my goals over other people's expectations. Permission to demand support instead of constantly providing it. Permission to pursue excellence instead of accepting accommodation. "I'm ready for everything," I said. Maria smiled, and I realized it was the first time in years that someone had looked at me and seen potential rather than problems. "Good," she said, "because Alex is about to make your life very interesting." She wasn't wrong. By the end of that week, Alex had restructured my entire training program around a competition timeline that assumed I was serious about racing rather than just participating. Morning track sessions, afternoon strength training, weekend long-distance work, and a nutrition plan that treated my body like the athletic machine it was becoming rather than the medical condition it had been labeled. The changes were immediately noticeable, not just in my performance, but in how I felt about myself. I woke up sore but energized, tired but purposeful. For the first time since my accident, my body felt like an ally rather than a limitation. At home, the contrast became impossible to ignore. While I was discovering new levels of capability and strength, my family's conversations remained focused on the same wedding details they'd been debating for months. Centerpiece heights, cocktail hour timelines, photographer scheduling, important details for an important day, but existing in a completely different universe from the world I was building at the track. The disconnect reached its peak on Thursday evening, when I came home from a particularly intense training session to find them in heated discussion about wedding favors. "The personalized candles are beautiful," Susan was saying, "but the chocolate boxes seem more practical." "But the candles will remind people of our special day every time they light them," Lily argued. "The chocolate gets eaten and forgotten. Personalized candles versus chocolate boxes." A debate that apparently required input from multiple family members and serious consideration of long-term memorial value. Meanwhile, I'd just finished a workout that had pushed my race times into genuinely competitive territory, and no one had asked about my day. "What do you think, Emma?" Lily asked, apparently remembering I existed. "Candles or chocolate?" I looked at the samples spread across the table, each option representing money that could have funded months of coaching or competition entry fees. The disconnect felt surreal, like being asked to choose between types of currency for a country I'd never visit. "I think," I said slowly, "your guests will remember your wedding based on whether they had a good time, not what they took home in a little bag." The practical response seemed to deflate some of the urgency around their debate, which clearly wasn't the contribution they'd been hoping for. "Well, yes," Lily said, "but the favors are part of creating that good time. They're part of the overall experience." Overall experience? Everything about her wedding was designed to create a specific experience, crafted memory that would justify the enormous investment of time, money, and family attention. My racing, by contrast, created experiences that were entirely internal. The satisfaction of improvement, the rush of speed, the confidence that came from genuine achievement. "I'm sure whatever you choose will be perfect," I said, which was what they wanted to hear rather than what I actually thought. But as I wheeled away from their planning session, I realized that my opinion on wedding favors didn't matter because I was already planning to be somewhere else that day. Not at the track, not at any actual competition, but somewhere in the mental space I'd been building where my goals took priority over my family's expectations. The decision felt less like rebellion and more like graduation. I was ready to move beyond being a supporting character in other people's stories and start writing my own. 3 weeks into my training routine, I discovered that Alex had been keeping detailed records of my progress in a leather-bound notebook that looked more like a medical journal than a coaching log. I only noticed it because he'd left it open. On the equipment table, while helping another athlete adjust their racing chair setup, my name appeared at the top of the page, followed by columns of numbers that documented every aspect of my development. Split times, heart rate data, technique notes, but also observations that had nothing to do with athletics. Emma arrived early. Despite family stress about wedding planning, asked about nutrition requirements instead of going home for lunch. Stayed late to practice starts without being prompted. The level of attention was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. In my family, detailed record-keeping was reserved for wedding vendors and medical appointments. It's not for tracking someone's voluntary achievements. Seeing my progress documented with such care felt like discovering that someone had been paying attention when I thought I was invisible. "You're not supposed to be reading that," Alex said, appearing beside me with an expression that was more amused than annoyed. "You left it open?" I protested, though I stepped back from the table guiltily. "I left it open because I wanted you to see it." He flipped through several pages, each one covered with similar detailed observations about different athletes. "Every serious coach keeps training logs. It's how we track what's working and what needs adjustment." Every serious coach? The phrase carried an implication that I was a serious athlete, deserving of the same professional attention he gave. 2 competitors who'd been racing for years. It was a designation I'd never thought to claim for myself. "What's this number?" I asked, pointing to a figure circled in red at the bottom of the page. "Your current 1,500-meter time," Alex said. "And before you ask, yes, it's good enough to qualify for regional competition if you can repeat it under race conditions." Regional competition. The goal that had seemed impossibly distant 3 weeks ago was suddenly within reach, transformed. From aspiration to achievable target, through daily increments of improvement, I'd barely noticed accumulating. "When's the next regional event?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from my late-night research sessions. 6 weeks. Sacramento. Alex's expression grew serious. "But Emma, qualifying time is just the entry requirement. Actually racing well requires a different level of preparation." A different level of preparation. Translation: more time, more commitment, more prioritization of training over everything else in my life, including family obligations that had seemed non-negotiable just a month ago. "What would that look like?" I asked. Alex pulled out his phone and opened a calendar app that was color-coded with the precision of a military operation. 2-a-day training sessions, starting next week. Morning track work, afternoon strength and technique. Weekends are long-distance endurance building, plus strict meal timing, sleep scheduling, and recovery protocols. 2-a-day sessions. Commitment would essentially eliminate my availability for wedding planning consultations, dress fittings, and family discussions about centerpiece arrangements. For the first time in months, I would have a legitimate excuse to be unavailable. For activities that had never felt optional. "That sounds perfect," I said. "Perfect?" Alex looked surprised by my enthusiasm. "Emma, this is serious commitment. Most people need time to consider whether they're ready for this level of intensity." Most people hadn't spent 3 years. Being treated like their time was infinitely flexible, and their goals were inherently secondary to everyone else's needs. Most people hadn't been looking for an escape route from family obligations disguised as inclusion. "I don't need time to consider," I said. "When do we start?" That afternoon. I came home to find the entire living room transformed into what could only be described as a wedding command center. Floor plans were taped to the walls. Vendor contracts were organized in labeled binders. My mother was coordinating with someone on speakerphone about floral arrangements with the intensity of a disaster relief coordinator. No. Peonies need to be a specific shade of blush," Susan was saying into her phone. "Not regular pink, not coral, but the exact blush tone we discussed. This is for my daughter's wedding, and everything needs to be perfect." The word that had become the family motto, applied with religious devotion to every detail of Lily's celebration, while my own achievements went unnoticed in the same house. Emma. Wonderful. You're home, Susan said, finally noticing my presence. We need to discuss your timeline for the wedding day. My timeline. As if I were a vendor requiring coordination rather than a family member attending a celebration. I maneuvered around the displaced furniture to reach my usual spot near the window, trying to avoid disturbing any of the carefully organized planning materials. The guest book setup needs to happen by 10 a.m., Susan continued, consulting a detailed schedule that looked like it could manage a space shuttle launch. Hair and makeup starts at 8, so you'll need to be ready by 7:30 at the latest. Hair and makeup. For managing a guest book. Because apparently my appearance required professional intervention to be deemed appropriate for my assigned role, actually, I said. I might not be available that early. I have training that morning. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen. Susan slowly set down her phone, giving me the kind of attention usually reserved for medical emergencies. Training, she repeated slowly. On Lily's wedding day. Regional qualifier preparation, I said, borrowing Alex's professional terminology. Competition season doesn't pause for personal events. Personal events. I'd deliberately chosen the phrase to minimize the wedding's significance, the same way they'd been minimizing my athletic pursuits for weeks. The symmetry was intentional and satisfying. Emma, Susan's voice carried the warning tone she'd perfected during my teenage years. This is your sister's wedding day. Not a personal event, not just another Saturday. It's the most important day of her life. The most important day of her life. Again. The phrase had become so overused it had lost all meaning, but the expectation behind it remained unchanged. Everything else should be sacrificed for Lily's perfect day. And this is the most important phase of my athletic development, I countered. Regional qualification doesn't happen twice. Athletic development. Susan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Emma, sweetheart, let's be realistic about it. You've been playing around with this racing thing for a few weeks. It's not like you're training for the Olympics. It's playing around. The dismissal hit exactly as it was intended to, reducing weeks of intensive training and measurable improvement to the equivalent of a hobby or recreational activity. But instead of the familiar sting of family disapproval, I felt something. New anger. You're right, I said calmly. I'm not training for the Olympics. I'm training for Paralympics. The distinction hung in the air between us, carrying implications that were impossible to dismiss. Paralympics weren't recreational. They were elite international competition, the highest level of athletic achievement in adaptive sports. Required years of dedication, professional coaching, and exceptional talent. Paralympics? Susan's voice climbed an octave. Emma, don't you think you're getting a little carried away? Getting carried away? Because having ambitious goals was apparently inappropriate for someone in my situation. I was supposed to be grateful for inclusion in other people's celebrations, not demanding excellence in my own pursuits. My coach thinks I have Paralympic potential, I said, which was a slight exaggeration of Alex's encouraging but measured assessments. Your coach has known you for 3 weeks, Susan pointed out. How can he possibly determine your Paralympic potential in 3 weeks? How can he possibly determine my Paralympic potential? The question revealed everything wrong. With how my family had been thinking about my capabilities since my accident, in their minds, my limitations were obvious and permanent, accessible by anyone with eyes. But my potential, that required specialized knowledge they didn't possess and apparently didn't trust. The same way talent scouts determine athletic potential, I said, through performance measurement, technique analysis, and competitive assessment. The professional terminology seemed to surprise her, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, which in a way I had. The language of serious athletics was as foreign to our household as astrophysics, but I'd been learning it daily through training sessions and conversations with athletes, who treated excellence as an expectation rather than an accident. Even if that's true, Susan said, clearly struggling to process this new version of me, surely you can take 1 morning off for your sister's wedding.
And 1 morning off. I donated
as if elite athletic training operated on the same schedule. As a part-time job, with negotiable hours and flexible commitments, as if missing a crucial training session was comparable to skipping a casual social engagement. Elite athletes don't take mornings off during competition preparation, I said. That's what makes them elite athletes. I'd claimed the identity so naturally that it surprised even me. 3 weeks ago, I would never have imagined applying such a term to myself. But sitting there defending my training schedule against family pressure, it felt not only accurate, but essential. Before Susan could respond, Lily appeared in the doorway. With an expression that suggested she'd been listening to our conversation from the kitchen, her face carried the particular mixture of hurt and indignation that she'd perfected during childhood arguments. "Emma," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I can't believe you're seriously considering missing my wedding for some training session." Some training session. It's a casual dismissal of something that had become the most important part of my daily routine stung more than I'd expected. But it also clarified something I'd been struggling to articulate. They weren't just failing to support my goals. They were actively minimizing them. "I'm considering prioritizing my athletic development over guest book management," I said. "There's a difference." "Guest book management?" Lily's voice rose to match her mother's earlier pitch. "Emma, you're not just managing a guest book. You're participating in my wedding. You're part of the celebration." Part of the celebration, but not part of the wedding party. Not included in the ceremony. Not invited to the pre-wedding activities or post-wedding gatherings. Part of the celebration in the same way that floral arrangements and chair covers were part of the celebration, functional, decorative, and easily replaced if necessary. "What exactly would I be missing?" I asked, sitting at a table while other people sign a book, smiling appropriately while wearing a dress chosen specifically to look good while sitting down. The accuracy of my description seemed to catch them off guard, as if they hadn't realized how their accommodations sounded. When described plainly, Lily's expression shifted from indignation to something that might have been guilt, though it disappeared quickly. "You'd be missing being there for me," Lily said, her voice taking on the vulnerable tone she'd always used to get her way. "Emma, you're my sister. I want you there because I love you. 'Cause I love you." The words should have melted my resistance. Should have reminded me of the bond we'd shared before. Disability and favoritism had complicated our relationship. Instead, they felt like manipulation disguised as affection. "If you love me," I said quietly, "why haven't you asked about my training? Why don't you know what Paralympic qualifying means? Why have you spent months planning a wedding that excludes me from everything meaningful while insisting that my presence is essential?" The questions hung in the air between us, each one pointing to contradictions in their treatment of me that they'd apparently never noticed. They wanted my presence but not my participation. They claimed to love me but ignored my achievements. They demanded my availability while dismissing my priorities. "That's not fair," Lily said, but her voice lacked conviction. "What's not fair," I replied, "is selling someone's wheelchair to buy your dress and then expecting them to be grateful for the opportunity to watch you wear it." The reference to my sold wheelchair hit like a physical blow. Both women recoiled, as if I'd slapped them, their faces reflecting the shock of having their financial priorities stated so bluntly. It was the first time anyone had directly connected those two events. The first time the transaction had been framed as a choice rather than a necessity. "That's not what happened," Susan said quickly. "We needed to prioritize the wedding expenses. And your insurance was covering a replacement chair." "A basic replacement chair," I corrected. "Not the custom equipment I'd saved for months to buy. Not the chair designed specifically for my measurements and needs. A hospital rental that gives me pressure sores and limits my independence." The medical details seemed to make them uncomfortable, as if my physical reality was too graphic for their wedding planning conversation. But I was done protecting them from the consequences of their financial choices. "Your custom chair will be replaced eventually," Susan said. "This is temporary," eventually I repeated. "After the wedding? After the honeymoon? After you've recovered from the wedding expenses? Eventually, when my needs become convenient again?" The timeline they'd never explicitly stated, but that. I'd understood from months of watching wedding expenses take priority over everything else. Eventually, when there was money left over from the perfect day they were creating for Lily. "Emma, you're being dramatic," Lily said, but her voice was weaker now. "It's not like we abandoned you. We're taking care of your transportation. We bought you a dress. We're making sure you're included." Included. The word that had become a weapon disguised as kindness. Included in ways that required no adjustment to their plans, no sharing of resources, no genuine consideration of my preferences or capabilities. Included as what? I asked. As your inspiration? As proof that your family supports disabled people? As a photo opportunity to show how generous and accepting you are? Each possibility hit closer to the truth than they probably wanted to admit. My presence at their wedding would serve their narrative about family values and inclusion, while requiring nothing of them except tolerance for my visibility. "That's horrible," Lily said, but she didn't deny any of it. "What's horrible," I said, "is having to choose between family loyalty and self-respect. What's horrible is being told that my achievements don't matter, but my presence is essential. What's horrible is realizing that you see my wheelchair as a problem to be managed rather than equipment for an athlete in training." The conversation had escalated beyond wedding planning into territory none of us had intended to explore. But once the words were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. The contradictions in how they treated me were now visible, impossible to ignore or rationalize away. "We don't see your wheelchair as a problem," Susan said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then why was it the first thing you sold when you needed money?" I asked. "Why is my transportation a logistical challenge instead of a simple accommodation? Why do all of your solutions involve me doing less rather than you doing more?" Questions revealed patterns they'd probably never examined consciously. Every problem involving my disability had been solved by reducing my participation, rather than increasing their effort. Every accommodation had been the minimum necessary rather than what would actually work well. That evening, I called Alex from my room while my family continued their wedding planning downstairs. The contrast between their excited voices discussing floral arrangements and my own need for athletic guidance felt like living in two different worlds simultaneously. "I want to register for Sacramento," I told him without preamble. "Emma, we talked about this being a big commitment," Alex said carefully. "Are you sure you're ready?" "I'm sure I'm ready to find out what I'm capable of when people take me seriously," I said. There was a pause on his end, long enough that I wondered if he was reconsidering his assessment of my potential. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality than I'd heard before. "Emma," he said slowly, "has anyone ever told you that you were chosen for something?" Chosen for something? The phrase was so different from anything my family had ever said about my accident or my disability that it took me a moment to process. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that some people are natural athletes who happen to have disabilities, not disabled people who happen to try athletics. There's a difference, and it shows up in training. Natural athletes who happen to have disabilities." The reframing was revolutionary, positioning my wheelchair as equipment rather than limitation, my potential as inherent rather than inspirational. "Which one am I?" I asked. "Emma," Alex said, "I've been coaching for 8 years. I've worked with recreational athletes, competitive athletes, and 3 Paralympic medalists. You have something that can't be taught. Something that can't be taught. Not just potential or promise, but actual talent that existed independent of my family's expectations or society's assumptions about disability." "What is it?" I asked. "Fire," he said simply. "Most people train because they want to get better. You train like you're trying to prove something to the world. That's the difference between participation and championship." Championship. The word sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in my room. I'd spent 3 years learning to be grateful for inclusion. And now someone was talking about championship as a realistic goal. "Register." "Me? For Sacramento," I said. "Emma, there's something else you should know about that competition," Alex said. "It's not just regional qualifying. There are scouts there from the national program. Paralympic pathway identification." Paralympic pathway identification. The phrase carried implications so far beyond anything I'd imagined that it felt like discovering a door to a completely different life. "Are you saying?" I started, then stopped, afraid to voice what I was thinking. "I'm saying that if you race well in Sacramento, people are going to notice. And once they notice, your life changes permanently. Are you ready for that? Ready for my life to change permanently? Ready to be seen as an athlete rather than a disability? Ready to have goals that mattered more than other people's convenience? Ready to discover what I was actually capable of when given the chance?" "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of my room listening to the sounds of wedding planning continuing downstairs. Lily's laughter drifted up through the floor, accompanied by Susan's enthusiastic responses to whatever decision they'd just made. The sound of a family completely absorbed in creating a perfect day for their golden child. But for the first time, in 3 years, I didn't feel excluded from their happiness. I felt liberated from it. They could have their perfect wedding, with their perfect dresses, and their perfect photos that told the story they wanted to tell. I was going to have something. Better, I was going to have a chance to discover who I really was when no one was watching. The morning I was supposed to die, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. for what had become my standard pre-dawn training routine. The house was silent except for the familiar creaking of floorboards as I transferred from my bed to my racing chair, a custom piece of equipment that Alex had somehow convinced a sponsor to loan me for the Sacramento competition. The difference between this chair and the hospital rental I used for daily activities was like comparing a sports car to a shopping cart. Sacramento was now just 2 weeks away, and my training times had dropped to levels that made Alex shake, his head in disbelief during our sessions. Yesterday, I'd clocked a 1,500-meter time that was not only competitive for regional qualification, but would have placed me in the top 10 at last year's national championships. The progression from recreational participant to legitimate contender had happened so quickly that I sometimes felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was becoming the best version of myself during the worst period of family relationships I'd ever experienced. Since our confrontation about the wedding priorities, conversations at home had been reduced to logistical necessities and polite exchanges that felt more distant than silence. Lily had stopped asking for my opinions on wedding details, not because she'd accepted my athletic priorities, but because my responses had become unpredictably honest. At the track, however, everything made sense. My body responded to training with an enthusiasm that felt like coming home after years of exile. Alex had introduced interval work that pushed my cardiovascular system to limits I'd never imagined, and my shoulders and arms had developed the kind of power that made ordinary tasks feel effortless. But more than the physical changes, I'd discovered a mental toughness that seemed to have been waiting dormant since my accident. Your race simulation yesterday was extraordinary, Alex told me as we warmed up for what he'd cryptically described as a special session. "Emma, I need to tell you something, and I want you to really hear me." The seriousness in his voice made me stop mid-stretch and give him my full attention. In the weeks we'd been working together, Alex had been encouraging, but measured in his assessments, always tempering enthusiasm with realistic expectations about the learning curve in competitive racing. "I've been in contact with someone from the Paralympic Training Center," he continued. "They've been tracking results from regional competitions, looking for emerging talent to invite to development camps." Paralympic Training Center. The phrase hit me like electricity, carrying implications so far beyond anything I'd allowed myself to imagine that it felt like he was speaking a foreign language. "They want to see your race footage from Sacramento," Alex said. "If you perform the way I think you will, they're prepared to offer you a spot in their development program." Development program? Not just recognition or encouragement, but actual investment in my potential. The kind of support that turned talented athletes into international competitors, complete with coaching, equipment, travel funding, and access to the highest levels of the sport. "What does that mean practically?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. It means relocating to Colorado Springs for 6 months out of the year. It means training with Olympic and Paralympic medalists. It means having access to sports science, nutrition experts, and equipment that most athletes never see. Alex paused, studying my expression. "It means your life changes completely." My life changes completely. The phrase should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like permission to want something I'd been afraid to admit I wanted. For weeks, I'd been telling myself that racing was about personal satisfaction and proving my family wrong, but sitting there listening to Alex describe possibilities I'd never dared consider, I realized that what I really wanted was to find out how good I could actually be. "There's something else," Alex said, his expression growing even more serious. "The scout who's been watching your progress. She's going to be at Sacramento, not just to watch you race, but to meet you personally." Meeting me personally? The Olympic and Paralympic world suddenly felt immediate rather than abstract, populated by real people who were interested in my specific potential rather than my general inspirational value. Her name is Coach Patricia Williams, and she's developed more Paralympic medalists than any other coach in adaptive athletics. Emma, she doesn't waste time on people unless she sees something exceptional. Exceptional. The word felt foreign when applied to me, carrying connotations of excellence and rarity that didn't align with 3 years of being treated as a burden, as requiring accommodation. But Alex's tone suggested he wasn't offering false encouragement or inspiration porn. He was describing measurable potential that could be objectively assessed. "What happens if I don't race well?" I asked. "Then you keep training and try again next year," Alex said simply. "But Emma, I've seen you under pressure during our simulation sessions. You don't just race well when it matters. You race better, racing better under pressure." The assessment felt like discovering a superpower I'd never known I possessed. Everything about my family situation had trained me to minimize myself under stress, to become smaller and more accommodating when tensions rose. But on the track, apparently pressure transformed into performance. We spent the morning working on race strategy and mental preparation techniques that felt more like military briefings than athletic coaching. Alex had studied footage of my likely competitors and identified tactical opportunities that could give me advantages beyond raw speed. The level of preparation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, treating my success as genuinely important rather than personally satisfying. By the time I headed home, my mind was spinning with possibilities that felt both thrilling and overwhelming. Paralympic development programs, relocating to Colorado, training with international medalists, a completely different life built around discovering my maximum potential rather than managing my limitations. I wheeled into the house to find it transformed once again, this time for what appeared to be a final pre-wedding planning session that involved not just my immediate family, but also Jake's parents and several bridesmaids. The living room looked like a bridal magazine had exploded, covering every surface with samples, schedules, and checklists that seemed to require input from everyone present. "Emma, perfect timing," Susan announced, as if I'd been summoned rather than simply arriving home. "We're finalizing the timeline for Saturday, and we need to confirm your availability for setup." My availability for setup. Because apparently, managing the guest book required preparation time that needed to be scheduled around my other commitments, though they'd never bothered asking what those commitments might be. "Actually," I said, "I won't be available Saturday morning." A training session. The conversation in the room didn't pause immediately, as if my statement hadn't quite registered among the flurry of wedding-related discussions. Then gradually, the voices quieted until my words hung in suddenly silent air. "Training session," Lily repeated slowly, as if I'd announced my intention to perform brain surgery. "Emma, Saturday is my wedding day." "I'm aware of that," I said. "But Saturday is also 2 weeks before the most important race of my life." "The most important race of my life." The phrase felt bold and accurate, carrying weight that I'd never attached to any of my personal goals before. In the context of their wedding planning, it also felt revolutionary. "Emma," Jake's mother interjected with the careful tone people use when addressing someone they consider unreasonable. "Surely your training can be adjusted for such a special family occasion." Adjusted for a special family occasion. The assumption that my athletic goals were infinitely flexible, always secondary to social obligations, felt like a familiar weight settling back onto my shoulders. Elite athletic training doesn't adjust. "For social occasions," I said, borrowing terminology that Alex had taught me. "Competition preparation requires consistent scheduling regardless of other events." Elite athletic training. The phrase seemed to surprise everyone in the room, as if I'd claimed membership in an exclusive club they hadn't realized I was eligible to join. Elite. One of the bridesmaids laughed, though it didn't sound particularly friendly. Emma, you've been doing this for like a month. A month. The timeline was technically accurate, but deliberately misleading, reducing weeks of intensive training and measurable improvement to the equivalent of a casual hobby trial period. I've been training for 5 weeks, I corrected. I'm being scouted by Paralympic development programs. Paralympic development programs. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Every person in the room was staring at me as if I'd just announced my intention to fly to the moon. Paralympic, Robert repeated slowly. Let's not get carried away with unrealistic expectations. Unrealistic expectations. The dismissal hit exactly as intended, reducing my legitimate athletic achievements to the equivalent of childhood fantasy. But instead of the familiar shame, I felt something sharper and more focused. What's unrealistic about it? I asked. I'm already qualifying for regional competition. My coach has connections to the national program. My times are competitive. At the national level, each statement was factually accurate, but stating them aloud in front of my family felt like speaking a language they couldn't understand. In their world, my capabilities were defined by my limitations. In the athletic world, I'd discovered limitations were simply training variables to be optimized. Even if that's true, Susan said carefully, surely the wedding takes priority. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event for your sister. Once-in-a-lifetime event. The phrase that had been weaponized against me for months, treating Lily's wedding as historically significant, while my athletic development was dismissed as recreational distraction. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me, I said. Paralympic scouting doesn't happen twice. The parallel structure of our claims hung in the air between us, both of us demanding priority for events we considered uniquely important. But where Lily's wedding had consumed family resources and attention for months, my athletic opportunity was being discovered in real time. What exactly are you saying? Lily asked, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that preceded major family confrontations. I'm saying that I won't be available for guest book management on Saturday morning because I'll be training for the most important competition of my athletic career. Guest book management. I deliberately used their own terminology to highlight how peripheral my role in their celebration actually was. Not participating in meaningful ways, not contributing to important moments, just managing a logistical detail that anyone could handle. You're choosing some training session over my wedding? Lily said, her voice rising with each word. After everything we've done to include you, after all the accommodations we've made, you're choosing to abandon me on the most important day of my life, choosing to abandon her. The accusation was so fundamentally wrong that it almost made me laugh. They'd spent months excluding me from meaningful participation while insisting that my presence was essential. They'd sold my equipment to fund their celebration while demanding my grateful cooperation. They'd minimized my achievements while claiming my support was crucial. I'm choosing to prioritize my goals over your convenience, I said. There's a difference. Convenience? Susan's voice climbed to match Lily's pitch. Emma, this isn't about convenience. This is about family loyalty and supporting your sister during the most important event of her life. Family loyalty. The phrase that had been used against me countless times, always demanding that I sacrifice my needs for their preferences while never applying the same standard in reverse. Where was family loyalty when you sold my wheelchair? I asked. Where was supporting your sister when you excluded me from the wedding party? Where was family priority when you spent months planning events I couldn't participate in while claiming my presence was essential? Each question hit like a physical blow, exposing contradictions in their treatment of me that they'd apparently never examined. They wanted loyalty without reciprocity, support without investment, presence without participation. That's not fair, Lily said, but her voice lacked conviction. What's not fair, I replied, is being told that my achievements don't matter, while my attendance is mandatory. What's not fair is having to choose between family acceptance and self-respect. Family acceptance and self-respect. The choice I'd been avoiding for months, hoping somehow to find a compromise that would satisfy both my need for athletic development and their demand for wedding cooperation. Emma, Robert's voice, carried the authoritative tone he'd used during my childhood when discussions had moved beyond negotiation. You will be at your sister's wedding. This is not optional. It's not optional. The phrase that had governed my life since my accident applied to medical appointments, family gatherings, and social obligations that were presented as choices but functioned as commands. You're right, I said, surprising everyone, including myself. It's not optional. I'm choosing not to attend. The words felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff I'd been standing on for years. I was choosing my goals over their expectations, my development over their convenience, my future over their present. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room stared at me as if I'd just announced my resignation from the family, which in a way, I suppose I had. Can't be serious, Lily whispered, her face pale with shock. I'm completely serious, I said. I'm going to Sacramento instead. Sacramento instead. The destination that represented everything. My family couldn't understand. Competition over cooperation. Achievement over accommodation. Excellence over acceptance. Emma, Susan's voice was trembling now. If you don't come to your sister's wedding, there will be consequences. Consequences? The threat that had shaped my behavior for years. It's the fear of family rejection that had kept me compliant, even when compliance required self-diminishment. I understand, I said. But there will also be consequences if I don't pursue this opportunity. Those consequences affect the rest of my life, not just one day, the rest of my life. For the first time in our conversation, I'd claimed a timeline that extended beyond their immediate event, a future that mattered more than their present, goals that outweighed their expectations. That evening, after the wedding planning committee had departed in shocked silence and my family had retreated to their respective rooms without speaking to me, I sat alone in the living room, trying to process what I'd committed to. I'd chosen athletic competition over family loyalty, individual achievement over group harmony, personal development over social obligation. The decision should have felt isolating, but instead it felt like finally breathing after holding my breath for years. I was going to find out what I was capable of when supported rather than managed, when my goals were prioritized rather than accommodated, when my potential was developed rather than contained. My phone buzzed with a text from Alex, heard through the coaching network that Coach Williams moved up her timeline. She's planning to attend your next training session this Thursday. Are you ready to meet your future? Ready to meet my future? The phrase sent shivers through me that had nothing to do with temperature. In 4 days, I would meet someone who could transform my life in ways my family couldn't imagine and apparently didn't want. But as I sat there in the silence of a house full of people who no longer spoke to me, I realized something that surprised me. Their disapproval no longer felt like rejection. It felt like freedom. Freedom to discover who I really was when no one was trying to manage my expectations or contain my ambitions. Freedom to pursue excellence without apologizing for wanting more than gratitude and acceptance. Freedom to choose my own definition of success rather than accepting their version of accommodation. The wedding would happen without me, and it would probably be exactly as perfect as they'd planned. But I was going to be somewhere better, doing something that mattered more than their approval ever could. I was going to be discovering what I was actually capable of when given the chance to find out. 6 months after I chose Sacramento over Lily's wedding, I found myself sitting in the Paralympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, reviewing video footage of my upcoming race with Coach Patricia Williams. The woman who had seemed like an impossible dream just months ago was now studying my technique with the intensity of a surgeon, identifying micro-adjustments that could shave hundreds of seconds off my already competitive times. Your start. Sequence has improved dramatically since nationals, she said. Pausing the video at the moment, my hands hit the push rim for the first stroke. But watch your left shoulder here. You're still carrying tension from that old compensation pattern. Old compensation pattern. The residual effects of years spent in poorly fitted equipment, chairs that had taught my body to work around limitations, rather than optimize for performance. Under Patricia's guidance, I've been systematically unlearning 3 years of accommodation and discovering what my body could actually do when properly supported. The transformation hadn't been just physical. Living in Colorado Springs, training alongside Paralympic medalists, having access to world-class facilities and coaching had revealed capabilities I'd never imagined I possessed. But more than the athletic development, I discovered a version of myself that existed entirely outside my family's expectations or society's assumptions about disability. My phone buzzed with a message from Alex, who'd remained my primary coach even as I'd gained access to the national program. Saw the news about your qualification? Your family must be incredibly proud. Your family must be incredibly proud. Alex had no way of knowing that I hadn't spoken to my family since the morning of Lily's wedding. When I'd left for Sacramento instead of staying for guestbook duty, the silence had been complete and mutual, a severing that felt more like liberation than loss with each passing month. I'd learned about Lily's marriage through social media, posts that showed exactly the fairy tale celebration they'd planned. Perfect dresses, flawless photography, seamless execution of every detail they'd spent months coordinating. The images showed a beautiful event populated by smiling family members who looked genuinely happy in my absence. The relief I'd felt, seeing those photos, had surprised me. They'd gotten their perfect day, and I'd gotten my freedom to pursue excellence without guilt or compromise. Everyone had one, even if they couldn't see it that way. "Patricia," I said, looking up from my phone, "what happens if I medal at Worlds?" The question would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, but my recent performance trajectory had moved. Medal contention from fantasy to legitimate possibility. At Nationals, I'd placed second in my classification, losing by less than 2 seconds to a 3-time Paralympic medalist. More importantly, my times had improved consistently through every round of competition, suggesting I performed better, under pressure rather than worse. "When you medal at Worlds," Patricia corrected with the confidence of someone who'd guided dozens of athletes to international podiums, "you'll have officially announced yourself as a legitimate threat for Paris. That changes everything." Paris. The Paralympic Games were still 2 years away. But in the world of elite athletics, 2 years was a precise timeline filled with specific benchmarks and strategic planning. Patricia had already mapped out my development cycle, identifying competitions that would optimize my preparation and ranking position. "What do you mean, changes everything?" I asked. "Media attention, sponsorship opportunities, speaking engagements. You'll become a public figure representing not just your own achievements, but the possibilities within adaptive athletics." Patricia's expression grew serious. "Emma, you'll have a platform that extends far beyond racing." A platform. The concept felt surreal after years of being treated as someone whose voice didn't matter in family decisions. Now, Patricia was describing a future where my words could influence public perception and policy around disability athletics. "Are you ready for that kind of visibility?" she asked. "Ready for visibility?" After 3 years of being made invisible, in my own family, the prospect of chosen visibility felt like the ultimate reversal. Not the inspiration porn kind of attention I'd always dreaded, but recognition based on genuine achievement and competitive excellence. "I think so," I said. My phone rang, interrupting our video analysis. The number wasn't familiar, but something about the area code made my chest tighten with recognition. Riverside Heights, California home. "I should take this," I told Patricia, stepping outside the training center into the crisp Colorado air. "Emma," the voice on the other end was Robert's, though he sounded older and more uncertain than I remembered. "Emma, I hope it's okay that I'm calling." The conversation I'd been both dreading and anticipating for months was finally happening. I'd wondered if they would reach out after seeing news coverage of my national team selection, or if the silence would remain permanent. "It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. "I've been following your racing results online," Robert continued. "Emma, what you've accomplished is extraordinary." I had no idea. "We had no idea you were capable of this level of achievement. No idea you were capable." The admission carried more weight than any apology could have. For years, they'd treated my limitations as permanent and my potential as minimal. Discovering That I'd reached elite international competition without their support or even knowledge must have been jarring. "Thank you," I said, unsure what else to offer. "Your mother and I have been talking, and we realize we made some serious mistakes in how we handled things before your sister's wedding. We didn't understand what racing meant to you or what you were capable of achieving. Serious mistakes." The euphemism felt inadequate for selling my wheelchair, excluding me from meaningful wedding participation and dismissing my athletic goals as recreational distraction. But it was more acknowledgement of error than I'd expected to receive. "We'd like to see you race," Robert continued. "At Worlds, I mean. If you're comfortable with us being there, see me race at Worlds." The offer felt surreal, like they were requesting access to a life they'd shown no interest in supporting when it required sacrifice on their part. Now that my success was publicly validated and internationally recognized, they wanted to witness. "That's an expensive trip," I said carefully. "We can afford it," Robert replied quickly. "Emma, we should have been supporting your training all along. Should have been celebrating your achievements instead of what we did. Another euphemism for prioritizing Lily's wedding over my athletic development. But at least it acknowledged that their choices had been wrong rather than necessary. "I'll think about it," I said, which was more consideration than they'd given. My needs during wedding planning? After ending the call, I sat outside the training center, trying to process the strange reversal of circumstances. 6 months ago, I'd been begging for basic accommodation and support. Now they were asking permission to attend my international competition, offering financial support they'd claimed was impossible when I needed equipment and coaching. The transformation felt like poetic justice, but it also felt hollow. Was this recognition when I was struggling to afford proper equipment? Where was this pride when I was training in borrowed gear and riding public transportation to practice? Where was this family support when it would have actually mattered? To my development, Patricia found me still sitting outside when she finished reviewing my race footage. "Everything okay?" she asked. "My father wants to attend Worlds," I said. The same father who told me I was being unrealistic about Paralympic potential 6 months ago. "Ah," Patricia said, settling onto the bench beside me. "The family reconciliation tour. I've seen this before with athletes who break through to elite levels. You have? Emma, when someone achieves international recognition in anything, people who dismiss them suddenly want to claim connection to that success. It's human nature, but it doesn't erase the history of what happened when support actually mattered. The history of what happened when support actually mattered." Patricia had summarized the problem perfectly. Her current interest in my success felt less like genuine reconciliation and more like association with achievement they'd actively discouraged. "What did other athletes do?" I asked. "Depends on the athlete," Patricia said. "Some find peace through forgiveness and rebuilding relationships. Others maintain boundaries and focus on the support systems that were actually there during the hard work. Maintain boundaries and focus on support systems that were actually there. The approach that honored the people who'd believed in my potential when it required faith, rather than simply acknowledging proven success." "Who was actually there for you during your development?" Patricia asked. The question was easy to answer. Alex, who'd seen potential in my first awkward training session and convinced sponsors to loan me proper equipment. Maria and the other. Athletes who'd welcomed me into their training group without question or condescension. Dr. Williams at the Rehabilitation Center, who'd connected me with adaptive sports programs despite my family's skepticism. Patricia herself, who'd taken a chance on an unknown athlete based on raw potential rather than established results. "People who aren't related to me," I said. Patricia smiled. "Those are often the people who see us most clearly because they're not invested in maintaining old narratives about who we're supposed to be. My family's image of me as someone requiring accommodation rather than someone capable of excellence had been so deeply embedded that even my success couldn't immediately shift their perspective. The thing is," I continued, "I don't need their approval anymore. 6 months ago, their recognition would have meant everything to me. Now it feels irrelevant." "That's growth," Patricia said. "When external validation becomes less important than internal satisfaction, You've achieved something more valuable than any medal. More valuable than any medal. The assessment felt profound, highlighting a transformation I'd barely noticed happening. Somewhere between leaving for Sacramento and preparing for World Championships. I'd stopped needing my family's approval to feel valuable. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Lily. Emma, I saw the news about your world team selection. I'm incredibly proud of you, and I'm sorry for how things ended between us. Could we talk? Incredibly proud of you. The sister who'd insisted I was being dramatic about Paralympic potential was now claiming pride in achievements she'd actively discouraged. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so indicative of how completely they'd misunderstood my capabilities. I showed the message to Patricia, who read it with the expression of someone who'd seen similar communications countless times. What's your instinct? She asked. My instinct was complicated. Part of me missed the family connection I'd once cherished, the sisterly bond that had existed before my accident changed the dynamic between us. But a larger part of me recognized that their current interest was motivated by public success rather than genuine understanding of who I'd become. My instinct is that they want to be associated with my achievements without acknowledging how their lack of support affected my development. I said. Trust that instinct, Patricia advised. You've built a life and career based on your own determination and the support of people who believed in you when it mattered. Don't let anyone rewrite that history to make themselves feel better about their choices. Don't let anyone rewrite that history. The advice felt like permission to maintain the boundaries I'd established, to honor the relationships that had actually sustained my development, rather than rushing to forgive people who'd hindered it. That evening, I drafted responses to both, Robert and Lily. To my father, I wrote that I appreciated his interest, but preferred to focus on performance rather than family dynamics during competition preparation. To Lily, I wrote that I was grateful for her pride, but wasn't ready for conversation about our relationship. Both messages were polite, but clear. I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't available for reconciliation that felt more about their comfort than genuine repair of our relationship. The real celebration of my world team selection happened at the training center. Surrounded by athletes and coaches who'd been part of my journey from the beginning, Alex flew out from California, specifically for the announcement, bringing a custom racing chair that sponsors had designed for my world championship competition. This is what believing in yourself looks like, he told me as I tested the new equipment. Emma, you've become exactly who I knew you could be when you first showed up at our track. Exactly who I knew you could be. The recognition felt profound, because it came from someone who'd seen potential when I couldn't see it myself, who'd invested time and expertise in my development when others saw only limitations. As I prepared for Worlds, surrounded by people who'd earned the right to share in my success, I realized that my family's absence from this moment felt appropriate rather than sad. They'd chosen to prioritize a single day of celebration over years of supporting my development. I'd chosen to prioritize my potential over their expectations. Both choices had led exactly where they were supposed to lead. They'd gotten their perfect wedding, and I'd gotten my perfect life. 3 weeks later, I stood on the podium at World Championships wearing a silver medal that represented not just athletic achievement, but complete transformation of what I believed I was capable of. In the crowd, I could see Alex and Patricia cheering with the enthusiasm of people who had been part of the journey from the beginning. My phone would later show dozens of messages from family members wanting to celebrate my success, but in that moment their validation felt as unnecessary as their earlier opposition had felt limiting. I'd discovered who I really was when no one was trying to manage my expectations or contain my ambitions. I'd found my people, my purpose, and my place in a world that measured success by performance rather than gratitude. And for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.